If you haven't watched the intro to this series, please pause the video now and do so before continuing. The purpose of this video is to compare punishments of mutilation in Deuteronomy with Islamic law. Mutilation, of course, referring to amputation of any type, removal of appendages as part of some sort of punishment, etc. In the Torah, there's only one example of this, and it comes from Deuteronomy 25, 11, and 12. If two men are fighting, and the wife of one of them comes to rescue her husband from his assailant, and she reaches out and seizes him by his private parts, you shall cut off her hand. Show no pity. There are multiple examples of various sorts of mutilation in Islamic law. Here's one of them. The Messenger of Allah would cut off the thief's hand for 1/4 of a dinar or more. Sahih Muslim. This is not a comparison of the penalty for theft. That penalty is easily more acceptable to the modern mind in the Torah, where a thief would be required to repay the owner of the stolen property over and above the original value of the stolen property, depending on the circumstances. That's in Exodus 22, for example. Rather, this is a comparative study of mutilation as practiced in each one of these legal codes. We'll start with Deuteronomy. Again, there's the verse, you shall cut off her hand, show no pity. I want to note that throughout this video, when I'm discussing the passage in Deuteronomy, I'm going to be discussing several different competing views. I only hold one of these views, as you'll later discover, but I want to address the other views in an attempt to be comprehensive, and because there are some others who hold these views, and I want to address them to be fair. If you're not interested in a comparative study of competing views, then feel free to skip forward as I'm describing some of these. It'll help you get through the video a little faster and get to the explanation that I find most plausible. What I'm going to do now is provide some background information and then attempt to systematize it into some possible interpretations of this verse. Now, referring to the seizing of the private parts, there is an analog in Middle Assyrian laws which requires the amputation of a finger if permanent damage is inflicted on a man's genitals. But Deuteronomy 25, 11 through 12, unlike the Assyrian law, does not mention that damage to the private parts is required for this punishment, so it's only partially analogous. For the phrase, you shall cut off her hand, Dr. Tigay refers to some interpretational problems with this verse. For example, the punishment seems out of proportion to what she has done. We previously noted that there is a partial analog in Assyrian law. However, damage is required to have been incurred by the man, but that's not the case, or at least it doesn't appear to be here in Deuteronomy. He says on page 484 of his commentary, these problems led Talmudic and medieval commentators to explain the crime and or the punishment in ways that seem far-fetched, but if correct, would make the law more understandable. He lists an example. The woman was wrong to use a method that humiliated her victim, but her punishment is not really mutilation. Cut off her hand refers to fining her, the monetary value of her hand, just as the complete Talionic formula refers, according to rabbinic exegesis, to monetary compensation. Dr. Tigay then adds a footnote referring to Rabbi Rashi. I'll read what Rabbi Rashi says in his commentary. You shall cut off her hand. Quote, this verse is not to be understood literally, but rather it means she must pay monetary damages to recompense the victim for the embarrassment he suffered through her action. The amount she must pay is calculated by the court, all according to the social status of the culprit and the victim. But perhaps it means that we must actually cut off her very hand? The answer is borne out from a transmission handed down to our rabbis as follows. Here, it says, do not have pity, and later in the case of conspiring witnesses, referring to Deuteronomy 19:21, the same expression is used, and our rabbis taught that these verses have a contextual connection. Just as there, in the case of the conspiring witnesses, the literal expressions in the verse referred to monetary compensation, so too, here, the expression, you must cut off her hand, refers to monetary compensation. Now, Deuteronomy 19:21 is lex talionis, nor must you show pity, life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot. So this phrase occurs again in Deuteronomy 19:21, nor must you show pity, same as it does in Deuteronomy 25, 11, and 12. And so this is the connection that Rabbi Rashi is talking about. Now, in Dr. Tigay's commentary, again on Deuteronomy, page 185, he says, "If anyone maims his fellow as he has done, so shall it be done to him, fracture for fracture, eye for eye, tooth for tooth. The injury he inflicted shall be inflicted on him." Talmudic exegesis holds that the formula is not to be taken literally, but means that the assailant is required to indemnify the victim with a sum of money that corresponds to the severity of the injury. That's all of Tigay's quote at this point. So Rabbi Rashi's idea is that lex talionis in Deuteronomy 19:21 was met by monetary compensation, and the same phrase, show no pity, also occurs in Deuteronomy 25:11 through 12. Therefore, these are connected. Since monetary payment is acceptable in Deuteronomy 19:21, thus it is the intent of the text as well in Deuteronomy 25:11 through 12. Now, Jeffrey Tigay cites another example of Talmudic commentary on this verse from his commentary on page 484. He says, "Seizing a man's genitals endangers his life, and cutting off a woman's hand is not meant as a punishment for the court to impose later, but a means available to bystanders to save her victim in case she won't release him." End quote. And so this is another way that the Talmudic exegetes dealt with this verse. It wasn't a penalty imposed later, but a means available to save the victim in case she won't release him. Tigay continues, quote, "The real intent of the law is to illustrate the moral duty of bystanders to save the life of a person being pursued, if possible, without killing the pursuer, but otherwise by killing him." In this reading, oddly, the wife represents the pursuer and her husband's opponent, the victim. He continues, "The meaning is, if a person is attacking another in a potentially lethal way, you may even wound the attacker if that is necessary to save the victim. If that doesn't suffice, you may kill the attacker." As Tigay notes a little further down on page 484 of his commentary, these explanations hardly express the original intent of the law. They illustrate, however, that puzzlement about the law is not solely the result of a modern outlook. Now, I'll conclude my reading from Tigay's commentary as well as this very brief survey from the Talmudic and medieval commentators. Now, the word for hand in Hebrew for this verse is problematic. Christopher Wright, among others, notes that the word is kop, not yod. Kop usually refers to the palm of the hand. I'll read from his commentary on Deuteronomy, page 269. He has a note which says, "The phrase, 'you shall cut off her hand,' may not be meant literally, but may be a euphemism for the female genital region, as feet for male genitals above," referring to the previous verses. If the lex talionis were being strictly applied and she had damaged the man's genitals, then some form of punishment was to be inflicted on hers. The word kop, he continues, usually refers to the palm of the hand. He then cites Genesis 32, verses 25 and 32, as well as the Song of Solomon, chapter 5, verse 5, in which case it looks like kop is a euphemism for the female genital region. Along these lines, Jerome Walsh notes in the Journal of Semitic Studies in 2004, the Hebrew word for cut, as in cut off her hand, used in Deuteronomy 25:12, elsewhere means to shave or clip. This would render the verse to mean, "You shall shave the hair of the groin area." And naturally, this verse is beginning to sound more and more strange to our ears, but this does correspond to a punishment of humiliation that existed in Babylon and Sumer. Analogous punishments were mentioned throughout the Old Testament in reference to shaving men's beards as well, and as Jerome Walsh states in the abstract to his article, the reading that refers to the shaving of a woman's pubic region is philologically and lexically superior to the standard translations, and it resolves the anomaly of one and only one law in the entire Israelite corpus that imposes physical mutilation as a punishment. And again, that's from the abstract to his article. So in this case, the penalty for one humiliating act, grabbing the man's private parts, though apparently without injury, would be one of similar humiliation, involving shaving the hair of the groin area of the female offender. Humiliation for humiliation, or lex talionis. So we have several interpretive options. There are many nuanced views that are possible, but based on the data that I've given to you so far, I want to present a couple general options for understanding this text. The first would be the simple face value reading of the English translation. The second would be the Kop versus Yod interpretation, which could refer to shaving of the pubic hair as a humiliating punishment instead of punishment by mutilation, as the face value reading of the English translation would say. The third would be the rabbinic readings that Dr. Tigay referred to in his commentary. The first one referred to giving of money, as I noted earlier, citing Rabbi Rashi and the connection between Deuteronomy 19 and Numbers 35. And lastly was the rabbi's second interpretation that I listed, which referred to cutting off the hand as the only way to save the victim, since the woman would not release him. Having briefly summarized these views, I'd like to evaluate some of the advantages and disadvantages of each. Number one, the face value reading of the English translation has some significant disadvantages in my view. It's out of character for the Mosaic Law, since it is the only case where mutilation is prescribed. This is in contrast to many ancient Near Eastern laws which have in themselves a context for mutilation as a punishment. In the Torah, this framework is absent. The law sort of comes out of nowhere. Number two, it does not take into account the nuances of the Hebrew language, the Kop versus Yod, or the milder form of the Hebrew word for cut that's used in this text. It is disconnected from the context of shame and humiliation in the preceding verses, which are associated with childlessness. This is significant, and I'll elaborate more on this later. And number four, it's incompatible with lex talionis, which places a limit on disproportional punishment. The Kop versus Yod interpretation has several advantages. At this point, I'll describe three. It accounts for the nuances of the Hebrew language. It is connected to the shame motif, continued from the preceding verses. It has historical context, given this punishment was prescribed in other ancient Near Eastern codes. Number three, the Talmudic exegesis involving payment of money. It does attempt to connect this verse to other areas in the Torah for continuity. The same phrase, "you shall have no pity," as in 25:12, for example, is in one of the verses the Talmudic sources link it to, namely Deuteronomy 19:21, wherein lex talionis is prescribed. However, further connecting this verse to Numbers 35:31 and other forms of indemnity is not consistent with the phrase, "you shall show no pity." In my view, monetary compensation is not an openly shameful form of punishment that would require an exhortation to show no pity. And again, in this view, as with the face value reading of the text, the continuity between this and the previous verses is lost. And number four, Talmudic exegesis involving cutting off the hand as the only way to save the victim. This seems forced, since this clarification is not made anywhere in the passage. It seems implausible that a woman would refuse to release her grip as her hand is being cut off. Again, it does not take into account the nuances of the Hebrew language, and again, lacks continuity of motif between it and the previous verses. The continuity is significant, as I mentioned earlier, and it's now what I want to describe. Shame is associated with childlessness in Deuteronomy 25:8-10, in the case where a man is commanded to remedy the childlessness of his brother if he were to die in such a state. If the brother refuses to do this, he is to go before the elders and testify. What he does next is a very strange ritual to our ears. What's important for our purposes in this video is to understand what Block notes in his commentary on page 583 about the nature of the punishment. Block says, Moses prescribes a ritual of public humiliation consisting of several elements. In the sight of the elders, the widow is to approach, and then Block goes through the description of the ritual. Block says, the action represented a symbolic action of shame, end quote. And that's very significant for our purposes. The nature of the crime and punishment in the previous verses is one of shame. In the ancient world, childlessness was a shameful thing. Again, this is all alien to our ears, but it must be understood to understand the context of this passage. If a brother was to knowingly contribute to the childlessness and therefore cessation of the lineage of his deceased brother, he was to be publicly shamed. The continuity between this text and our passage of concern, verses 11 and 12, is expressed by Bloch, and I'll quote from him again on page 584 of his commentary. He says, "This short paragraph, referring to verses 11 and 12, is linked to the preceding by vocabulary, characters, and motif. However, whereas the previous paragraph concerns shameful behavior by the brother-in-law, this fragment involves shameful behavior by a wife." And so these two passages, which initially seem completely disconnected, are actually very tightly connected. I understand Deuteronomy 25, 11, and 12 as being connected to and in the same context of childlessness and shame in the preceding verses. The woman knows that her actions can result in damage to the private parts of the man and his inability to bear children. Given this is a shameful act, her punishment is likewise shameful. But why is it shameful? The woman is simply defending her husband from his attacker. Well, presumably the woman would have had numerous other options that she could have used. She could have attacked the assailant with a shepherd's crook or with stones, for example, but instead she risks injury to herself by actually involving herself in the fight and grabbing the man in a sensitive area. She exceeded the minimum required to defend her husband and performed an action that could impede the attacker's ability to procreate. So in addition to the woman contacting the genital region of a man who was not her husband, she performs an action that could result in him being incapable of fathering children. And now we're back to the childlessness motif that was covered in previous verses and the association of it with shame in the ancient world. And shame for shame is, as I described, in accordance with lex talionis prescribed in Deuteronomy 19. Continuity between these two verses is further demonstrated by a sort of reciprocal relationship between them. The brother who is supposed to carry on his deceased brother's lineage and neglects to do so and undergoes a shameful punishment is incurring shame because he is leaving his deceased brother's wife childless. Again, a shameful thing in the ancient world. And so if he is going to shame this woman, then his punishment should be shame as well. And so in the preceding verses, the shame is endured by the woman. In the following verses, the shame is endured by the man. And just as the punishment was shameful for the man in the preceding verses, in Deuteronomy 25, 11, and 12, the punishment is one of shame for the woman. For these reasons, I favor the Kop versus Yod interpretation, which would render the reading something like, "You shall shave off the hair of her groin, you shall show no pity." I propose this was the original understanding of the text for the following 6 reasons. Several were previously discussed. I'll just summarize all of them. As Dr. Walsh noted, this reading is philologically and lexically superior, and so it accounts for the nuances of the Hebrew language. Number 2, as Dr. Walsh again summarized succinctly, it resolves the anomaly of one and only one law in the entire Israelite corpus that imposes physical mutilation as a punishment. 3, it is connected to the childlessness shame motif continued from the preceding verses. 4, it has a historical framework, given this specific punishment was prescribed in other ancient Near Eastern codes. 5, the shameful punishment for a shameful act is more consistent with lex talionis as well as the preceding verses. And finally, there is sort of a reciprocal relationship between the two. In the preceding verses, the woman is shamed, and therefore the man is shamed as a punishment. In our passage of concern, the man is shamed, and therefore the woman is shamed as a punishment. So when put together, these laws address issues relevant to both sexes during that place and time. So there are 6 reasons why mutilation in Deuteronomy 25, 11 through 12 is not what it seems. Given this is the only instance of alleged mutilation in the Torah, we'll move on to examples in Islamic law, which are much more straightforward. Let's look at the mutilation up to and including beheading as required for theft and other crimes. As noted earlier, the Messenger of Allah would cut off the thief's hand for 1/4 of a dinar or more. Sahih Muslim 4398. Sahih al-Bukhari 2648 talks about a woman who committed theft. She was taken to the Prophet, who ordered her hand to be cut off. This parallels the Quran, which requires amputating hands in recompense for what they commit. This is Surah 538. Now, is this to be understood literally, or figuratively. Muhammad's companions took it as literal. In Sahih al-Bukhari, Volume 9, Book 87, Chapter 21, Ali cut off a thief's hand. Later he realized, incidentally, that the thief had been falsely accused, and he had cut off his hand in error. Clearly, Ali, for one, did not think this was figurative in any way. Let's turn to the tafsir. Allah commands and decrees that the hand of the thief, male or female, be cut off. During the time of the Jahiliyyah, this was also the punishment for the thief, and Islam upheld this punishment. That's Tafsir Ibn Kathir on Surah 538. Tafsir al-Jalalain says, for the same verse, cut off their hands, that is the right hand of each of the two from the wrist bone. It is explained in the Sunnah that the amputation applies to the stealing of a quarter of a dinar and upwards, and if the person were to reoffend, then it's the left foot, and then subsequent reoffenses would be the left hand, followed by the right foot. Indeed, this is how it's codified. For instance, Reliance of the Traveler, Section 014.1, it's the right hand. Then next, it's the left foot, etc. More from the Quran in Surah 8:12, referring to the striking of the necks and striking from them every fingertip. It's unclear which order this is to be performed in. Does one strike the heads before one strikes the fingers, in which case one is just mutilating a dead body? Or does one strike the fingers before one strikes the head, in which case you're torturing someone before you behead them? The penalty for those who wage war against Allah and His Messenger and strive upon the earth to cause corruption is none but they be killed or crucified, or that their hands and feet be cut off from opposite sides, or they be exiled from the land. That is for them a disgrace in this world, etc. Citing Surah 533 in his tafsir, al-Jalalain refers to an incident where some men killed one of Muhammad's shepherds. In response, Muhammad cut their hands and feet, and their eyes were branded with heated pieces of iron. A parallel narration adds, then he, that's Muhammad, threw them in the sun till they died. A man was accused of misbehaving with one of Muhammad's concubines. Muhammad didn't take the time to ascertain the truthfulness of the accusations. He ordered Ali to go and strike his neck. By a stroke of luck, Ali approached the man while he was bathing and noticed that the man was apparently a eunuch, and Ali spared his head. Muhammad had ordered his death in error. I could cite many more examples, but I'll conclude with the infamous incident of the Jews of Banu Qurayza, who had surrendered to Muhammad. Then he, Muhammad, sent for them, the men and the boys who had obtained puberty, and struck off their heads in those trenches as they were brought out to him in batches. There were 600 to 700 in all, or possibly 800 to 900, depending on which source you read. Therefore, the Islamic texts, as they're interpreted by competent Islamic scholars, attest to the unequivocal practice of various forms of mutilation from fingertips, hands, and feet up to and including beheading. This was commanded by Allah in the Quran, practiced by Muhammad himself, as well as his companions. Given the very well attested body of textual and historical evidence for this, these practices were subsequently encoded into Islamic law.